Hello and welcome to week 13 in sociology, and certainly, as I've said it probably a dozen times, one of my favorite topics to talk about is healthcare. I have a soapbox on this one. We'll get into that about healthcare and health insurance, but before I get too carried away with that, let's go to my little slideshow here, chapter 19, Health and Medicine. Remember, we're coming at this from the point of view of sociology. So, whenever we talk about sociology, we talk about culture. And culture includes, as we've been saying, norms, values, expectations. And I'm going to include here technology. So our perceptions of health, healthcare, wellness, our entire system of healthcare, taking care of yourself versus not taking, aging, all these expectations and they're built into our cultural background and built into norms, values, expectations, and technology. So we could take a look at some examples here. What does it mean to be healthy? What is the norm to be healthy? What is the norm in your family, for yourself, your community? What does it mean to be healthy? How does that relate to how old you are? Are you supposed to be able to run up a pair of stairs? What is it? What does healthy mean? Those are norms that are put forth by our cultural upbringing. Values associated with different illnesses. Not all illnesses are created equal. I was alive and around and aware during the entire beginning of the AIDS epidemic in the United States. Talk about this pandemic right now, an epidemic for AIDS in the 1980s. 70s and into the 80s, that was initially treated as literally individuals within Congress reading into the congressional record their opinion that this was God's declaration of disgust with homosexuality and they all deserved to die. So here were the individuals dying of a disease they contracted, and the value system of the United States was just in upheaval about how to respond to this. And of course, over the years, that obviously has changed. But even to this day, if you're in a fundraiser, for example, I do fundraising for the American Lung Association every year by participating in the Trek Across Maine. It is, for clean air, smoking education, and of course lung disease, lung cancer, and whatnot. It's usually not that hard to get people to donate if they're going to be the donating kind. And so I get people to donate for my ride, and I get to raise money for worthy causes. I would imagine if this was a trek across Maine to support AIDS, I might still have some difficulty raising funds. Even though, let's say a person has a disease such as lung cancer because they smoked their entire lives, or a person has AIDS because they had numerous incidents of unprotected sex with lots of different partners. They both, as a result of their human choices and behaviors, but one is going to be is seen as different than the other still to this day. So what I'm saying is that values still play a role in defining what is okay in terms of an illness and what is not okay in terms of illness. We still have this notion of, well, you brought it on yourself. How much sympathy do you want from me if you brought it on yourself, or if it wasn't your fault? It's sort of going back to that, when we talked about wealth and we talked about people who had acquired wealth, they had achieved identity, and then we had individuals that it was just bequeathed upon them. And we had different value systems associated with that. The same sort of connotation comes up with illnesses. If you went and got it yourself because of foolish behavior, then shame on you. If you caught it or it got you, it wasn't your fault, then that's different. So you can see these value systems shifting even in the definition of what we think are illnesses. Now another one, expectations. What do I do when I'm sick? What are the expectations for my behavior? What are the expectations for the behavior of people around me? What am I supposed to do? And I'm going to get into detail with that in just a moment. And finally, our medical systems widely different across the world, technology and our expectations for what that means. And largely, our expectations of how we experience our medical establishment is really tying us to the system that we have in the United States. We have extremely high expectations for testing and for immediacy, and everything's an emergency. I want everything now, and that really ties us to a capitalist system of healthcare in the United States that I think eventually we're just going to have to get rid of that. And so I'll get to that in just a moment. For now, let's take a look. What do I do when I'm sick? What is it? I'm going to bring up some terms in sociology that we have talked about before, and that's status and role. Now, think of your status as a job title, and think of role as your job description. What is the job description of someone who is sick? Now, it's interesting to examine this because of the way we apply it. And I'm going to bring up soapbox number 1. If I have a cold, I'm expected to not go to work. I'm expected to stay home, in bed, isolate so nobody else gets it, take care of myself, take medication as prescribed, and most importantly, I'm expected to get better and return to my normal life. It is very important, and I want to emphasize how important it is that we have these expectations associated with being sick. How I'm going to react, how I'm going to take care of myself, what I'm going to do in the meantime while I'm getting better, and then what's going to happen after. And certainly I'm not going to go, I get a cold, and then I'm not going to go running out barefoot in the snow anytime soon after I'm recovered from that. That would be irresponsible. Now, I want you to keep those in mind as we imagine how we apply those same expectations to a different illness, such as mental illness, let's say depression. Now, the model would be you're sick, therefore you don't go to work, you stay at home, you isolate, get better, take your medications. When you get better, return to normal life. But that's not what happens. In fact, we may perceive a person who's depressed, and there's clinical validity to this, but not in the way that we usually think, that an individual shouldn't stay at home. They're sick, but we'd want you in a different role. You should be working. You should get up. You should fight this. We would never say that to someone who has a cold or a cut on their hand. We would never go up to someone who has a cut on their hand and say, you know what? You just need to have a positive attitude about this. Even though we are very sure that the illness out of my control aspect of something like major depression is as out of somebody's control as the cut on their hand. They can no sooner rise up out of bed and feel good about the day as a person can look at their hand and heal the cut. Yet we perceive these as different. So what happens is, this is the mentality of it. Understand this in the way it really manifests. We could have different standards, and we do. If we approach it that way, I can approach the person who has depression in a different way, and maybe encouraging them to do things and getting energy out there and exercising and eating right and doing all those things is part of the treatment. But what usually happens is this. If an individual doesn't doesn't go to work, doesn't they're supposed to take care of themselves, but they're not, it is refusing to take medication because of the side effects that it has, and it's a cyclical disease that's going to come around every once in a while, then it's not a real illness. It doesn't meet that behavioral expectation from our culture that would necessitate, you're not really sick. And that is the source of stigma. You are acting this out. This is not real. It's all in your head. Well, of course it's all in your head, but it is really an illness. And that is part of that discrepancy that we see in our society about how people view different kinds of illness, particularly illnesses that they're not obvious to the naked eye. We look at someone we don't necessarily know they're depressed. We look at someone we know when they have a cold. The nose is all red, puffy eyes, they're coughing, and all of that stuff. And it's easy to say that person's sick, and it's very easy to look at the next person and say they're not really sick. And they're not playing the right role anyway. And it makes for some confusing perceptions, not only on the people who are observing individuals who have mental illness, but also those individuals themselves. Imagine the individual who's been convinced they're sick from a mental illness, convinced that it will never go away, that it's going to be cyclical, and then they themselves apply the rule of you don't work when you're sick. And I've met individuals who, with the right kinds of supports and the right kind of enterprise and the right opportunity, could probably get gainfully employed, will say to me, I can't work, I have a mental illness. Now, they may be right. They may be at this point in their lives, in this point of their motivation and whatnot, but there's nothing about being sick with a mental illness that necessitates that the person will never, ever work or can't work toward that kind of goal. Yet an individual may have internalized sick equals not work. Therefore, that is now my identity. And the very, very powerful messages come from our social perceptions of what does it mean to be sick and what is the job description of someone who's sick. Now, in terms of our medical systems and inequality in our medical systems, I want to introduce you to three concepts. One is socialized medicine, universal health care, and single payer systems. Now, these are three separate concepts, kind of my thing. One of my largest soapboxes is this. For one, let's get it out of the way. Socialized medicine, when we look at countries, there's several countries around the world, it's not a popular system. Socialized medicine is the entire medical system is within the government employee system. This is similar, let's say, to the military. The entire medical military establishment is employed by the U.S. government. They're employees, they're federal employees or state employees or whatever in the military. In socialized medicine, fully socialized medicine, the entire mechanism is public, meaning owned by the government and everybody is a government employee. It's actually not the best kind of system that's out there. It's good to have public enterprises like that. It's good to have state hospitals, for example. It's good to have clinics and whatnot that are supported by federal funds, but it's not the best system for delivering the best care. The other concept we have is universal health care, the other one that I put on the screen. Now, universal health care is an implied status that every individual within a particular geographic area or political structure or country has equal access to health care. Now, universal health care rarely occurs in the kind of capitalist system that we have going on in the United States. In fact, there's large gaps of individuals who are not receiving necessarily benefits from their work that include health care and can't afford to buy health care. And it's very disturbing and frustrating for some of those people when laws like the Obamacare come along and we feel forced to buy health care, even though it's actually probably something we should all get. Now, the reason for that is not that we will be necessarily having health insurance or be able to access health care. The reason for moving into that universal status that everybody has health insurance, whether it's publicly paid or not, that you have health insurance allows us to ensure that if you go to the hospital, you will not accumulate a bill that will be impossible for you to pay, leading you into bankruptcy and leading the hospital into writing off those expenses and increasing the cost of other services to other people in order to make up for that difference, which is the current status. That's what we're looking. We don't have universal health care in the United States, so therefore there are uninsured individuals, even under the law, there are uninsured individuals who will go to the hospital, will not ever be able to pay for the extravagant bill that they get there. The hospital cannot refuse care. They can just submit a bill. The individual will get into the consequences of not paying that bill. It could be bankruptcy. It could be, just paying on that debt for the rest of their lives. While the hospital increases the other costs because they have to maintain a bank account for money to deal with these situations because the lights still had to get paid. Now, the last one I introduced, single payer systems. Now, single payer systems, probably of all of the, universal healthcare systems that exist in the world, single payer systems are the most successful. And they're most successful for a lot of reasons. For one thing, the rules about what is paid for and what is not paid for are equitable across everybody who receives that insurance. Everybody has the same plan. Can't go from one insurance company to the other and get better benefits at one. Everybody has the same benefits. So everybody's equitable in terms of what their insurance will cover. The second thing, we all kick in for that part. It's usually government run. Sometimes let's say in Canada, it's provincial. The administration of the money that is given to each province to manage healthcare is managed at what we would call the state level, but at the provincial level. So each province has its money that it received from the federal government, that it received from the taxpayers to pay for all of the healthcare for their citizens in their province. By being a single payer, however, you're able to negotiate rates. If anybody wants to provide services, and it's capitalist. A doctor wants to go up into Canada and open up an office, they can charge whatever they want, but if they're going to charge somebody's insurance, the insurance is only going to pay this rate for it because they are the only game in town. That doesn't keep specialty doctors from going up and offering services for cash. They can still do that. It's a capitalist country. But most people have the insurance. Most people are expecting that their insurance is going to cover at least, probably most of the time, 100% of their costs. And because that's been negotiated at that high level. The same with medicines. Medicines cost thousands of dollars a dose here. The country of Canada has turned to those pharmaceutical companies that said, if you want to sell this drug in our country, this is how much you're going to sell it. Because there's only one buyer, and they can insist on controlling the costs. So the actual cost of delivering high-level quality care in Canada is less because the prices are negotiated down. Doctors still make good money. There's still people that want to be doctors in Canada. There's no truth to the idea that they're migrating but masses down to the United States, and there's no truth in the idea that people from the United States are massing up into Canada, or that Canadians are coming down into the United States to get care because they're waiting for care up there. Now, this is where those expectations come in. When I was in British Columbia, my mom needed an MRI. The MRI, the only one, she lived in a city roughly the size of Lewiston in terms of population, more spread out, but a pretty big place. The hospital did not have its own MRI, and there was no mobile MRIs. If she wanted an MRI, she was going to have to go down to Vancouver, which is 500 miles away. Now, what this means is that individuals will only get an MRI if they really, really need it. In the United States, we've come to expect an MRI simply as a procedural, because there are so many MRIs. Even small hospitals will have their own MRI. Very expensive machine. And well, just in case, might as well. The MRI machine is right there. That is money that is being spent that won't necessarily have to be. Now, statistically, most of the time, we send people to the MRI as a procedural process, and there's nothing found. Canadians and other individuals who have single-payer systems see that as waste. we should have a reason to send you to the MRI, and when we do, we will pay for it. In fact, my sister-in-law, who had cancer, had to go all the way down to, she lived in Prince George, 500 miles away from Vancouver, had to go down to Vancouver for weeks at a time in order to receive her chemotherapy. Now, that's very inconvenient. However, as inconvenient as that was, the Canadian system paid for her treatment and paid for her hotel and paid for all of her meals while she was down there. And so there you have it. You have different system, much less expensive to operate the Canadian, per capita operate the Canadian system. I've included in the course book a number of videos exemplifying different systems around the world, most of which are socialized in some way, not completely, but, and I think France comes out on top, as being one of those. Now, in terms of the United States really not getting on board, here I have this little map. The green areas of the world are the ones with free and universal health care. Free meaning it's paid for collectively by the people's taxes. Like almost all of South America, Russia, China, Australia, Canada, of course, and Greenland, Iceland, all of Europe, all have these systems. And look at the red countries that have no free or universal health care. And we have the lower Sahara countries in Africa, some parts of the Middle East, and the United States and Indonesia. These areas we're really not on board with what the rest of the world has discovered, that the best way to get productivity out of your people is to take care of them. The government has a role in taking care of people when they're sick so that they can get back to work, and supporting them, making healthcare not an issue when it comes to choosing your work or where you live. Or I have personally known individuals to stay in jobs that they hate because the insurance is paying for their children's specialized care, and if they went to another employer, they would lose that benefit because it would be treated as a pre-existing condition from the next insurance company. I cannot imagine something more tragic or more ridiculous in terms of how we operate our healthcare system here in the United States. So that's my soapbox. I had a little graphic for that, but we should be doing this. Now, one of the last things I'm going to talk about here is disability. Now, disability represents a condition that actually limits a person's ability on something. So it's actually a dis means not ability. So it's specific to something. So people can have mobility disabilities. They can have sensory disabilities such as hearing and vision, even taste, sensation on their skin. They can have illnesses of the mind, mental illness and whatnot, that account for particular abilities and inabilities and whatnot. So when we're discussing disability, for one, the focus really needs to be on the part of the word, not what they can't do, but what they can do. What can the person do? What is their ability? Because if a person uses a wheelchair for transportation, the only thing that's wrong is the fact that they can't use their legs. Everything else is pretty normal. And so if we could have that perspective about disability, that we're focusing on the ability. We use this with language too, that we try to emphasize this with language, that it's politically correct language, but it's very appropriately so. When we refer to someone who has a mobility disability, we would say a person who uses a wheelchair. It's not a wheelchair-bound individual. I put the person first. It's a person with mental illness. It's a person with schizophrenia, not a schizophrenic. We should make effort within our language to say that the disability is separate from the individual in significant ways. It can be, now, major mental illness has a characteristic of being pervasive. It's chronic, pervasive, and persistent. It stays, it's chronic, and it's pervasive, and it affects a lot of their lives, but it never affects all of their lives. And it affects different parts of the lives in different ways. So the focus on ability is very important. And in no way is this more emphasized that when the particular disability is hidden. By hidden disabilities, I mean those that we can't readily see, and yet we need to appreciate that they are barriers to individuals functioning, including being blind, cognitive disabilities, deaf, mental illness, being on the spectrum, abuse, learning disabilities, post-traumatic stress disorder, trauma, and anxiety. We don't see these things, but they have an effect on the person, and they're still a person first, a person with a learning disability, a person on trauma, a person who's experienced trauma, a person who has deafness or hard of hearing, a person who's blind or low vision. Every one of these, person-first language to understand the challenges that individual has. Then it brings us to one of the most important legislations that I've ever had the pleasure of working with. At one point in my career, I was the director of Maine Independent Living Services, and it was an agency that served cross-disability, both as an advocate for ADA accommodations and also as a source for grant funding for accommodations for work or for home. So we would supply people with equipment in order for them to maximize their functioning despite having limitations brought on by disability. Now, the Americans with Disabilities Act was legislation that has profoundly impacted the world. My brother, who lives in Canada, inspects buildings and has a side work inspecting playgrounds for safety measures. When I asked him one time, what regulations do they use in Canada in order to determine accessibility onto playgrounds, accessibility into buildings and whatnot, and he said, we use the Americans with Disabilities Act. So the Americans with Disabilities Act is actually the working document for regulating buildings, access, and whatnot in Canada. So this is a very, very influential, very, very profound document. And being in the position to teach people about it, to advocate for them to be able to advocate for themselves, for access and whatnot, and to understand how this actual law changes lives. It's just been one of the most proudest aspects of my career to be in that role. So let's take a look at the actual ADA itself and what it does. And first off, it demands that a person at work, in the public, if they have a disability, is eligible for reasonable accommodations. Now, they use the word reasonable because the ADA was never meant to be, a to-do list. It wasn't meant to be directive. It was meant to create a dialogue between the individual who has a barrier to their functioning and the provider, a store or a business office or, something like that where they want to do business or work. So it's a dialogue. What's reasonable? Let's get this dialogue happening. The law mandates the discussion. And the determination of reasonable is a process of having that discussion of the resources that are available in order to make the changes for that individual to be able to access that building, or let's say, or to be able to take that class. The other part of the ADA is to remove barriers, remove artificial barriers. Let's say, and it's painfully easy to talk about this when we talk about issues with mobility. A set of stairs is a barrier to going into the building and has nothing to do with the person's ability to do whatever it is they want to do in that building, be it to conduct business or visit and look at the artwork or to do their job. So within reasonable accommodations, it is perfectly okay to create an alternative way for that person to roll into the building instead of the unsurmountable barrier of stairs for a person who's using a wheelchair. And so it is that physical barrier, and we often use the word barrier as kind of a wall between us and our goals, and the discussion is how to get through that barrier. And I want, keeping with that analogy, there's a lot of ways to get on the other side of a barrier. You can climb over it, you can dig under it, you can blow it up, you can build a door, you can change the goal on the other side. There's all kinds of ways to change barriers. And this law provides for the discussion on how to address those barriers. And it perceives the disability. The person who uses a wheelchair doesn't have a disability until they experience a barrier. So the problem is not that they use a wheelchair. The problem is that the building they want to get into has no ramp. And you see that it takes the problem, doesn't take the disability, but it takes the problem and locates it outside of the individual. This is a profound difference in thinking about where the problem is. Before ADA, before the independent living movement, before all of these things happened within the United States, individuals with disabilities were considered to be a problem to be solved. How can we make them walk again? How can we make individuals think clearly again? How do we get them to not be depressed anymore? And these are still ways in which people act, but in terms of the here and now, an individual with disabilities should still be able to function as best as they can by the removal of artificial barriers between them and their goals. And the final aspect of here is this applies to non-essential activities. This is very, very important. The ADA will apply to, I'm going to go back to the person using a wheelchair. The business that they want to conduct has nothing to do with stairs. So therefore, the ability to climb up the stairs is not an essential job duty for, let's say, their accounting job inside of the building. Going upstairs is not necessarily an essential aspect of being an accountant. And these are the kinds of discussions that can happen. Now, let's say the person had a palsy. They had a condition where they weren't able to use their fingers. And you say, well, they can't use a computer. Okay, now, using a computer might be an essential activity. Can we find now a reasonable accommodation? Can we get a voice-activated computer? Can we use a joystick? Can we use other kinds of, and there's plenty of devices that have been done to do that. Now, recently, in the last 10 years or so, there was an individual on the pro golf circuit who had vascular leg issues. I think this was going on. They couldn't walk. And they petitioned that they could compete by driving around in a golf cart because they could still hit a ball. They could still do all the golf things. They just couldn't walk from hole to hole. And this created an entire discussion about, is walking hole to hole part of the essential aspect of playing professional golf? Now, professional golf, as you've probably seen on television, if you looked at that, nobody's using a cart. Nobody's driving to the next hole. They have to walk. It's part of the endurance of it. The discussion was had and the conclusion was made that walking from hole to hole and thus the fatigue of walking from hole to hole was an essential aspect of the job, and therefore it was not subject to reasonable accommodations. Therefore, the individual couldn't play and compete in the PGA because they couldn't do the walking part. It's not fun for that individual, but it shows you where that discussion goes in terms of looking at a particular job analyzing the essential components to it, those components are not necessarily subject to accommodation. The non-essential ones are. Okay? And there's always a discussion, because if there's technology that's available to make an essential function accessible, then we use it. Then it becomes reasonable. It's a reasonable accommodation. So very, very interesting dialogues come out of the application of the ABA. Now here we are at our assessments. Discussion A, I'm going to have you're reviewing those videos on different insurance. I hope you are equally appalled by our system as I am. I have no qualms about getting political about that. And then I want you to discuss the ADA as it relates to learning disabilities, some of the ways that we experience the application of learning disabilities, application of ADA, here at KVCC. And that brings us to the end of this particular lecture, and I will 2 discussion boards, that's it for this week, and I will see you in those discussions, and have a great week.